This morning's book is one that Amy and I used to really like growing up. It's so old and beloved that it has no cover anymore. The Book of Giant Stories. A careless giant once sat on top of a very small gnat. The gnat looked around and said with a frown, "That giant has ruined my hat." Chapter 1. The Little Boy's Secret. One day, a little boy left school early because he had a secret to tell his mother. He was in a hurry to get home, so he took a shortcut through some woods where 3 terrible giants lived. He hadn't gone far before he met one of them standing in the path. When the giant saw the little boy, he put his hands on his hips and roared, "What are you doing here, boy? Don't you know whose woods these are?" "I'm on my way home," answered the little boy. "I have a secret to tell my mother." That made the giant furious. "Secret?" he bellowed. "What secret?" "I can't tell you," said the little boy, "or it wouldn't be a secret anymore." "Then I'm taking you to our castle," said the giant. Stooping down, he picked up the little boy and plopped him into his shirt pocket. Before long, the first giant met a second giant who was twice as big, 3 times as ugly, and 4 times as mean. "What's that in your pocket?" asked the first giant. "A boy," he answered. "Says he has a secret he won't tell us." When the second giant heard that, he laughed a wicked laugh. "Won't tell us, eh?" he chuckled. "Well, we'll just see about that. To the castle with him." The giants thumped down the path. In a short time, they came to a huge stone castle beside a muddy river. At the door, they met the third giant, who was 5 times bigger, 6 times uglier, and 7 times meaner than the second giant. "What's that in your pocket?" he asked the first giant. "A boy," he answered. "A boy," chuckled the third giant. He brought his huge eye close to the pocket and peered in. "Says he has a secret he won't tell us," said the first giant. When the third giant heard that, he laughed a terrible laugh. "Won't tell us, eh?" he asked. "Well, we'll just see about that. On the table with him." The first giant took the little boy from his pocket and set him on the kitchen table. Then all 3 giants clustered around and peered down at him. The little boy looked at the first giant. He looked at the second giant. He looked at the third giant. They were truly enormous and quite mean-looking. "Well," said the first giant. "We're waiting," said the second giant. "I'll count to 3, said the third giant. 1, 2. The little boy sighed a big sigh. "Oh, all right," said the boy. "I suppose I can tell you. But if I do, you must promise to let me go." "We promise," answered the giants, but they all winked sly winks at one another and crossed their fingers behind their back, because they didn't really mean to let him go at all. The little boy turned to the first giant. "Bend down," he said. When the giant leaned down, the little boy whispered into his ear. When the giant heard the secret, he leaped up from the table. His knees shook, his tongue hung out. "Oh no," he shouted. "That's terrible." And he dashed from the castle, ran deep into the woods, and climbed to the top of a tall tree. He didn't come down for 3 days. The second giant scowled at the little boy. "What's wrong with him?" he asked. "Never mind," said the little boy. "Just bend down." When that giant leaned down, the little boy stood on tiptoe and whispered into his ear. When the giant heard the secret, he leaped up so fast, he knocked his chair over. His eyes rolled, his ears twitched. "How awful!" he roared, and he raced from the castle, ran over a hill, and crawled into the deepest, darkest cave he could find. The third giant scowled fiercely at the little boy. "What's wrong with them?" he asked. "Never mind," said the boy. "Just bend down." When the giant leaned down, the little boy climbed onto a teacup and whispered into his ear. When that giant heard the secret, he jumped up so fast he ripped the seat of his trousers. His teeth chattered, his hair stood up. "Help!" he cried, "help!" And he dashed from the castle and dived headfirst into the muddy river. The castle door had been left open, and since the giants had promised the little boy that he could go, he walked on home. He told his mother the secret, but she didn't yell and run away. She put him to bed and fed him some supper. And that is the bed that I want, in that cozy little nook right there. It would be difficult to make the bed, though. The next morning, when the little boy woke up, he was covered from head to toe with bright red spots. "Now I can tell everybody what my secret was," he said with a smile. "My secret was, I'm getting the measles." George, the unusual giant, never was cross or defiant. And oddest of all, George really was small. He was just a peanut of a giant. Chapter 2. The Giant Who Was Afraid of Butterflies. There used to be a cranky witch who lived at the top of a hill in a creaky old house with 11 black cats and any number of spiders and bats. In the valley below lived a huge giant whose thundering footsteps shook the ground when he walked around. The witch despised the giant because every time he went walking, the ground shook so much that bats kept tumbling from her ceiling and plopped into her lap or her soup. Sometimes the witch became so angry that she would leap onto her broom and streak down over the valley to scold the giant. But to the huge giant, the witch looked no bigger than a pesky mosquito buzzing around his head. He never paid much attention to her, and that made her angrier still. Finally, the witch decided to cast an evil spell on the giant. Far into the night, she stirred her bubbling pot and added witchy things like poison ivy and pig's toes and thistles. She muttered and cackled and screeched until at last the spell was ready. Then she rolled her eyes and croaked, "Boil and bubble, witch's brew. I'll fix that giant when I'm through. When I've cast my evil spell, tomorrow he won't see so well. My spell will play tricks on his eyes to make things look 2 times his size." The next morning, the giant opened his eyes and looked to see what sort of day it was. The first thing he saw was a squirrel scampering down a tree. Because of the witch's evil spell, the squirrel looked 2 times bigger than the giant. With a frightened roar, he leaped backward and knocked down 3 trees. A bird landed on the grass to hunt worms. To the bewitched giant, the bird looked twice his size. This time, he fell into a pond and splashed out most of the water. All right, so here's the squirrel first. Everything the poor giant saw looked bigger than he was. A butterfly scared him silly. A dragonfly looked big enough to drag him off. When a fuzzy caterpillar crawled toward him, the giant became so upset, he ran to the far end of the valley. Honey, I Shrunk the Giant. Just then the cranky witch zoomed overhead, cackling. "How do you like my little magic spell?" she shrieked. "Now perhaps you'll behave yourself and stop stomping around, shaking the ground, and disturbing my supper." To the giant, the witch looked huge as she zipped around his head. Shaking with fright, he dashed out of his valley, around the far side of the hill to hide. It happened that a small village lay on the other side of the hill. A little boy from the village was walking down the road. When the giant saw the boy, he tripped over a farmer's barn and smashed it as flat as a dinner plate. "Don't hurt me," he cried. "You're bigger than I am." "That's silly," the boy said. "I'm only a little boy and you're a great big giant." "I know," the giant sighed, "but the witch on the hill has cast a spell on me, and now everything I see looks bigger than I am. I'm frightened by birds and worms and squirrels and butterflies and caterpillars and even little boys. I don't know what I'm going to do." The little boy sat down beside the giant and helped him think. After a while, he had an idea. "Maybe you need glasses," he told the giant. "If you wore glasses, you could see things again the way they really are. Why don't you come to the village with me and ask the eye doctor to help you?" That idea pleased the giant very much, but as they walked along the road to town, a bee frightened him, and he accidentally kicked over a windmill. A cow scared him so badly that he accidentally squashed a hen house. A puppy frightened him into knocking down several lines of full of clean clothes. "I think you'd better wait here," the boy told him. "I'll bring the glasses to you." "All right," the giant sighed, "but do hurry." And he sat down beside the road and waited. Soon the boy returned carrying a huge pair of glasses. "I hope they fit," he said. "They were the biggest ones I could get." The giant placed the glasses on his nose and squinted through them. The boy looked tiny, the way a little boy should look to a huge giant. Birds looked no bigger than gnats. Trees looked no bigger than grass. The giant smiled a giant smile. "You're a good friend," he told the boy. "Now let's take a little walk up that hill." The giant carried the boy with him up to the witch's creaky old house. She was not at all pleased to see them coming. "Shoo!" she shrieked. "Go away! Leave me alone!" But the giant wasn't frightened anymore. He picked up the witch's flying broom and snapped it between his fingers like a matchstick. With a scowl, he chased away all 11 cats. Then he let loose all the bats and spiders from the creaky old house. Finally, he snatched up the witch herself. "Are you ready to behave yourself?" he rumbled. "Oh, all right," she snapped. "You win. Put me down and I'll remove the spell." And she did. After that, the giant and the little boy often took long walks together up and down the valley. The giant's thundering footsteps still made the ground shake, and the cranky witch still sat in her creaky old house on the hill and muttered to herself. But when the bat plopped into her soup, she just helped it out. Never again did she try casting a spell on the little boy's giant friend. There once was a giant named Groans, who lived in a castle of stones, and often he said, I'd sure like some bread, but I hate grinding up all those bones." Chapter 3. The Giant Who Threw Tantrums. At the foot of Mount Thistle lay a village. In the village lived a little boy who liked to go walking. One Saturday afternoon, the little boy was walking in the woods when he was startled by a terrible noise. He popped behind a bush. Before long, a huge giant came stamping down the path. He looked upset. "Tangled, bangled, Bringlepox, the giant bellowed. He banged his head against the tree until the leaves shook off like snowflakes. Frangle-wangled whippersnack, the giant roared. Yanking up the tree, he whirled it around his head and knocked down 27 other trees. Muttering to himself, he stalked up the path toward the top of Mount Thistle. The boy hurried home. I just saw a giant throwing a tantrum, he told everybody in the village. They only smiled. There's no such thing as a giant, the mayor assured him. He knocked down 27 trees, said the little boy. Must have been a tornado, the weatherman said with a nod. Happens around here all the time. The next Saturday afternoon, the little boy again went walking. Before long, he heard a terrible noise. He zipped behind a tree. Soon the same giant came storming down the path. He still looked upset. Polly-wogging fizzle-snatch, he hollered. Throwing himself down, he pounded the ground with both fists. Boulders bounced like popcorn. Scowling crossly, the giant puckered his lips into an O. He drew in his breath sharply. It sounded like somebody slurping soup. Pooh, he cried. Grabbing his left foot with both hands, the giant hopped on his right foot up the path toward the top of Mount Thistle. The little boy hurried home. That giant's at it again, he told everyone. He threw such a tantrum that the ground trembled. Must have been an earthquake, the police chief said. Happens around here sometimes. The next Saturday afternoon, the little boy again went walking. Before long, he heard a frightening noise. He plopped behind a rock. Soon the giant came fuming down the path. When he reached the little boy's rock, he puckered his lips like an O. He drew in his breath sharply with a loud, soup-slurping sound. Phooey, he cried. I never get it right. The giant held his breath until his face turned blue and his eyes rolled up. Fuzzle humper backawacket, he panted. Then he lumbered up the path toward the top of Mount Thistle. The little boy followed him. Up and up he climbed to the very top of Mount Thistle. There he discovered a huge cave. A surprising sound was coming from it. The giant was crying. All I want is to whistle, he sighed through his tears, but every time I try it comes out wrong. The little boy had just learned to whistle. He knew how hard it could be. He stepped inside the cave. The giant looked surprised. How did you get here? I know what you're doing wrong, the little boy said. When the giant heard that, he leaned down and put his hands on his knees. Tell me at once, he begged. You have to stop throwing tantrums, the little boy told him. I promise, said the giant, who didn't want anyone thinking he had poor manners. Pucker your lips, the little boy said. I always do, the giant assured him. Then blow, the little boy added. Blow? Blow. The giant looked as if he didn't believe it. He puckered his lips into an O. He blew. Out came a long, low whistle. It sounded like a train locomotive. The giant smiled. He shouted, I whistled! Did you hear that? I whistled! Taking the little boy's hand, he danced in a circle. You're a good friend, the giant said. Thank you, said the little boy. Sometime, maybe we can whistle together, but right now I have to go. It's my supper time. The giant stood before his cave and waved goodbye. The little boy seldom saw the giant after that, but the giant kept his promise about not throwing tantrums. We never have earthquakes, the mayor liked to say. Haven't had a tornado in ages, the weatherman would add. Now and then they heard a low, long whistle somewhere in the distance. Must be a train, the police officer would say. But the little boy knew his friend the giant was walking up the path toward the top of Mount Thistle, whistling. There once was a silly old witch who captured 2 frogs in a ditch. She named one Pog, the other one Wog, but she never could tell which was which.